Hello once again. I hope everybody had a good Saturday night, a safe Saturday night at the homecoming dance. Everybody got home safely and enjoyed their time together. If you remember Friday before that, we talked a little bit about cells in relation to certain functions. What components of those cells have specific functions? And we used that information and linked it to what we already know about components of a city. And from that, hopefully, we created some similarities between those two relationships. So for Monday's class, we're going to use this video to help drive those components. This is a starting point. We will work with this video, and in class we'll identify the key components and build from those key components as we go. So once again, this is just a foundational type video to help reaffirm some of those components that we talked about Friday and to build on some new ones. So if you could just make sure that you're following along throughout the video. Each section will address some components that are relevant and some things we should tie into those relationships. So our first topic, we're talking about cells and tissues. We know that cells and tissues are unique. From a cellular standpoint and from a tissue standpoint, these aspects carry out all chemical activities needed to sustain life. And that's pretty important. We know that cells are the foundational blocks, the building blocks of all living things. We've already hit on this in relation to levels of organization. We used what we knew about cells to talk about a topic that's relevant in a large number of our lives, and that being cancer. In building off of cells, we know that tissues are groups of cells that are similar in structure and function. And we know anatomy and physiology is structure and function. So those are things we can relate to this topic, and those are things that we will build on. We know the cell is unique. We've talked about a variety of those components Friday. Cells are not all the same. There's different types of cells. You have animal cells, plant cells. We'll talk briefly about the difference between those. But we know that all cells share general structures. And these structures are unique. These structures have roles. These structures have functions that we talked about Friday and that we'll continue to build on. In general, cells are organized into three main regions. You have the nucleus. Talked about this in relation to the governing body of a city and the importance of that. We'll continue to build on that. Cytoplasm, mentioned that briefly in the video. They related that to kind of a swampy area or wetland area surrounding a city. And then the plasma membrane, which we'll continue to build on and learn more about as we progress through this information. So the nucleus, obviously we talked about this. The nucleus is the control center of the cell, pretty important. The nucleus is housed in the nuclear envelope. The nuclear envelope contains the nucleus and some of the components associated with that. We know the nucleus contains genetic material, DNA. The nucleus is broken down into three regions, and each of these regions has a specific role and a specific function. One being the nuclear membrane, the other being the nucleolus, and the third being chromatin, which we'll talk about as we go. So let's start with the nuclear membrane. This is kind of a unique aspect of the nucleus. It's a barrier, meaning that it's involved in protection. It's involved in moving information throughout the cell from the nucleus to the other portions of the cell and back again. It consists of a double phospholipid membrane. We'll talk about this. We'll summarize this. We will not spend a whole lot of time on that. But this is a component of the movement of the information. Our third aspect here, we know that the nuclear membrane contains pores, and these pores allow for the exchange of material and information between the nucleus and the rest of the cell. Building on, we know that a nucleus has nucleoli. In general, there's more than one or more nucleoli in the nucleus. And this is the site for production of ribosomes. And if you remember from our video, ribosomes were pretty important. They were involved in protein synthesis. And if you remember, proteins, from our last section, proteins are an organic compound. We should remember that organic compounds contain carbon, contain hydrogen, contain oxygen, contain a couple other things, but in general, those are the three main ones. We know that ribosomes move. They move to and from the cytoplasm through those nuclear pores, which allow the exchange of information to take place between the nucleus and the rest of the cell. Chromatin, another component of nucleus. We'll talk about this a little more in depth as well. Chromatin are composed of DNA and proteins. chromatin are moved throughout the nucleus, and chromatin condenses to form chromosomes when the cell divides, which we'll talk about as well. Plasma membrane. Plasma membrane is pretty important. This is a barrier for all the cell contents. And we'll talk a little bit about this barrier in relation to plant and animal cells. We know that plasma membrane facilitates support, it facilitates protection. We know, as we mentioned, the plasma membrane is mostly found in animal-based cells. It has very similar components to the cell wall from a structural standpoint and from a protection standpoint. We'll link those two ideas as we progress next week. We know it has a double phospholipid layer. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but this does relate to polarity. We talked about polarity in relation to chemistry of life and why certain molecules are polar. So we'll relate that to what we've learned prior to this. We know the plasma membrane also contains proteins, cholesterols, and glycoproteins. And from a organic standpoint, we should have some idea of what those things are. We'll continue to build on that as well. The plasma membrane is pretty unique. As we made mention, a couple things to focus on. It's a extracellular fluid. It's like a watery type environment, and it relates to the cytoplasm, which we'll talk about. And if you remember from the video made mention of this relationship around a cell, as we spoke to a few moments ago about the watery type environment, wetland-based environment, very marshy. They related that to the surroundings in and without a city in certain examples. So plasma membranes are unique. Plasma membranes have a variety of specially based functions. For example, they have microvilli, which are finger-like projections that increase surface area for absorption. And we know what do cells need. We talked about this when we talked about chemistry of life, right? Cells need water. Cells need oxygen. They need these types of material for survival. So microvilli are instrumental in allowing cells with the ability to acquire these types of resources so they can survive. Plasma membrane continue. We know that the plasma membrane has certain junction points. We won't spend a whole lot of time on this, but we'll identify those points and the role that they play. So we have membrane junctions in relation to tight junctions. You can see the location on the diagram. They're desmosomes as junction points and gap junction points as well. Once again, we won't spend a whole lot of time on this. We will talk about their role and the role that they play in relation to specialization, and then we'll go from there. Cytoplasms. Talked about this briefly in the video as well, and we've made mention of it a couple times. We know this material outside of the nucleus and inside the plasma membrane, so it kind of creates a buffer. It creates a buffer between portions of the nucleus and the other organelles that are outside of the nucleus. We know that it involves systole, which is a fluid that suspends other elements. Organelles we talked about briefly in our video Friday. These are the metabolic machinery of the cell. And inclusions, these are non-functioning units, which we'll get into briefly. But we know the cytoplasm has a couple other roles, and we've made mention of those from an organelle standpoint. And many of these organelles are housed in this area of the cell, in the cytoplasm. And we made mention of the ER, endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, rough ER, ribosomes, plasma membrane, nucleus, Golgi apparatus. So all of these functions, all of these organelles have a specific function. So from a summary standpoint, we know that cells and tissues create the foundation of all living things, the building blocks, if you will, for life to occur. Cells are broken down into specific regions: nucleus, cytoplasm, and plasma membrane. We've made mention of a couple of these concepts in Friday's last video. We know the nucleus has specific roles. The nucleus contains information that's important to our genes and genetic movement of information between generations. We know that the nucleus is made up of three regions: a membrane, a nucleolus, and chromatin. We know that The membrane has a specific role within the nucleus. We'll continue to build on that. It has certain functions. We know that the plasma membrane is an area where organelles exist, where organelles move, where organelles function. So, and cytoplasm we talked briefly about, and the organelles that exist in that area. So for Monday, we'll continue on this, and once again, let me just reinforce the fact that this video just is giving you some of the basic information associated to the topics we'll cover Monday. So if you could, watch through this video, and we'll go from there. Thank you.